From Minneapolis, Minnesota, welcome to Playwright Center's Theater Begins Here.
Today, theater begins with translations, but first, a membership highlight on Script Club. Script Club is a free program connecting avid readers with new plays from our Playwright member community. Each month, we will share 2 to 4 members' plays and collect readers' feedback. If you'd like to submit your own work, we accept and review scripts on a rolling basis, giving priority to those who actively participate in the programming. Meaning, the more you read and give feedback to others, the more likely your script will be selected. For more information, check out the link to our website in the bio. And now, on to the show.
I'm Hannah.
I'm Alayna.
And this is Theater Begins Here, a podcast for our 2,500 Playwright members around the world.
And anyone else who just wants to hang out and hear us talk about topics in playwriting and theater making.
We are here today with Wendy Weckwerth, who is a freelance dramaturg, editor, writer, translator, and educator with more than 20 years of experience. She has participated in the development of new work locally at the Playwright Center, Theater Novi Most, History Theater, Theater Latte Da, and at other venues nationally. Her translation projects have been produced at Yale Rep, Robert Woodruff's adaptation of Ingmar Bergman's screenplay for Autumn Sonata, and August Strindberg Rep, Christina. Wendy has taught at Yale, Dartmouth, Colby, Mount Holyoke, Bard, and Macalester colleges. Her training is DFA and MFA from the Yale School of Drama, a BA from Vassar College. And her website is wendyweckwerth.com. Welcome, Wendy.
Thank you.
So the first question we'd like to ask is, how did your theatrical journey begin?
Well, my first theatrical experience was as the narrator in a production that somehow involved a safari. It was like The Elephant's Child or something, some parable. And that was in elementary school. And I guess I was hooked. I got to wear a safari hat and be the narrator. And I thought that was pretty fun. And from there, many other things. I did a lot of theater in school, high school. And then when I went to college, though, I thought that I needed to do something much more practical with my life. I come from practical Minnesota stock. So I thought it was going to be a chemistry major. And then I had to decide between a class to continue that major or continue the theater major. And I turned toward theater and that was it. Sometimes I think, what if I'd become a chemist? But not for very long do I think that.
Was there something that tipped you over, like that was the deciding factor for you?
I don't really remember. I don't remember it being an intellectual decision so much as an instinctive impulse. Sort of like, I don't know, I don't mean to make it sound like I just kind of make random decisions all the time, but it's sort of like how at I feel like that decision was akin to when I can't decide what I want at a restaurant, I narrow it down to 2 things and then choose at the very last minute when, the server is like, okay, what do you want? And I just kind of follow my instinct in that moment once I've narrowed it down. And I feel like that decision happened something like that, where I couldn't figure out what the right choice, I'm trying to put that in verbal quotes, was. So I just let instinct take over.
I love that. I think that it's good to trust those moments of instinct.
Mm-hmm.
So you are a multi-hyphenated artist. I feel like people really love to say multi-hyphenated, but I think that really holds and rings true for you. I mean, you're a dramaturg, an editor, a translator. You also write. So how did you get into those practices? What led you there? And where did you start with all those hyphenates?
Yeah, and I mean, when I was young, I thought I liked acting. And then in college, I realized that that wasn't the life for me. When I learned more about what an actor who's trying to pursue that as a career has to do, I thought, oh no, that's not, all that rejection at auditions and just long periods of time, often between gigs, and also I just really liked analysis and thinking about the texts in from more of a kind of outside perspective than that sort of joy of acting, or at least my experience of it was that kind of thinking from inside a character. So I thought that maybe I wanted to be a director. So after college, before I even applied to grad school, I decided I needed to work for a couple of years and think about which of those I wanted to head into. And over time, I thought, right, dramaturgy and this kind of thing that no one knows exactly what it is. And that's what's kind of great about it, because it's many different things at any given moment in any, and every project demands its own approach, but underneath it all is a kind of ongoing curiosity and examination of how to best tell this story, the one right in front of you at this moment. And so even though, Alayna, you're saying I'm a multi-hyphenate, I guess I would say, well, yes. And all of those hyphenates for me go back to dramaturgy, go back to this core question of whether I'm helping someone tell a story or I'm charged with telling a story. I'm always asking, how does this story right in front of me right now, on the page, on the stage, whatever, how can it best be told? And what are the strategic ways to elevate it to its best self? And I just enjoy doing that from many different angles.
So how did that lead to translation work? Like, where did that come in following this dramaturgical lens and curiosity?
Yeah, well, translation, what I find so fascinating about it is that, again, you are starting with a playwright's vision you're starting with the established vision of a playwright. And it happens to be in another language, which, to effectively translate, you need to know that language. But then it's this, and it seems like it might be a kind of step-by-step act, right? Like, here are these words. I'm going to directly put them into the words of English. But in fact, that's impossible, because never does a language smoothly go one-to-one into another. And also how words hit the ear, right? So assonance, dissonance, rhythm, all of those things can never be exactly parallel. So it's this so the act of translation, in my view, is this really fun mix of intellectual challenge, right? Making sure you tell this story well and try to put in all the layers that the playwright has done, all of the sort of literary flourishes and kind of what is idiosyncratic about that author's voice, trying to capture that in English and give English-speaking audiences an opportunity to experience a piece they wouldn't otherwise get to really hear in the same way. Of course, we can all attend something in another language, which is, by the way, a really fascinating thing to do as a spectator. Go attend, French theater, or wherever you happen to be, go see some theater. It's kind of a beautiful process and learning, like how that you're probably going to get 85% of what's happening, even though you don't understand the words. So I don't know if that answers your question, but what I love about translation is that kind of creative mix of needing to, I don't know, it's almost like you're writing alongside the original play, because you're utilizing both your kind of analytical brain and your creative brain to try to put together a facsimile of this experience that an author has written in another language, and sometimes in another era. So much of my translation is Strindberg, and so I'm also keeping in mind that I'm translating not just for English speaking audiences, but for audiences 100 plus years later, 125 years later. And our tolerance for wordiness and repetition is just a little different than in the original.
You've been talking a lot about this. Can you add some other things that are like considerations when you're doing a translation? You talked about like rhythm of the language, and you're also talking about when it was versus now, you know, the language. Are there other things that you prioritize as you're thinking about, like, how do you go from one language to another?
I mean, sure. There are also, idiomatic phrases that we use in English that aren't very legible to others. And the same is true of other languages. So in Swedish, for example, there aren't really swear words in the same way that we swear. There are, but so emphasis or saying something kind of sharp or in a kind of intense way, it just happens in a different form, sort of, especially in Strindberg's era. So there's just the need to render from one language to another, the idiosyncrasies of that original language. So what's the parallel in English? English has a lot more words than many other languages, because we are a little more open to borrowing, just pulling language words from other language families. And so between Swedish and English, for example, there are many more words in English. So one of the things that I pay attention to when translating from the Swedish is not repeating words when we have other synonyms, because to our ear in English, because we have such a big vocabulary, those repetitions feel wrong or grating, or like they're making meaning sometimes in a way that if the original isn't using that repetition in the same way, it's just a repetition because that's the word and there isn't another choice. Then if you don't consider that when transposing it into another language, in a way you're sending a different message than the original. And so all of those things are judgment calls. And again, I think that's part of the fun, because it's partly a bit of a puzzle, right? A puzzle-like challenge. And then there's the part where, finding the right words, finding the exact kind of turn of phrase, or, particular, sometimes a rhyme, or avoiding a rhyme, right? That's all quite creative and almost like writing poetry. So it's a combination of the constraint of the original, which seems like it would really narrow down what you're doing, but it's one of those cases where constraint actually fuels creativity, I think. And it becomes really fun to figure out, well, okay, how can I render this really complicated idea that in Swedish uses one word, but in English, I'm going to have to use three, but I don't want that line to be really long, because the point is, right, it's a fast-paced dialogue. So how am I going to solve that? And sometimes you reach those moments where you're like, oh, I think that's great, that works. And other times where there's that sticky spot that you're still going to see there, at your eighth pass. And you may or may not ever kind of get to the point where you feel like you've solved it, but you probably get closer and closer.
I realized we didn't ask, what language do you usually translate in? And then also, how proficient, if you're someone that's interested in translation, do you need to be in the other language?
So usually I translate because I've focused on Strindberg when I was doing my dissertation. So most of my translating is in Swedish, although I have done a little bit of translating in Norwegian, a little bit in Spanish, and a little bit in French, which are languages I have also some proficiency with. You are doing as a translator, if you're interested in translation, I mean, I think that's a question one can only answer for oneself, right? So there are certainly translations, I'm putting that in verbal quotes or attempting to, out in the world where the playwright who's done it or whomever, the translator, who may be a famous author in another realm, will put their name on it and call it a translation, but they don't actually speak the original language. They just, for example, really admire that play and want to do their version of that play. And so that is certainly one kind of translation. And I'm not here to judge that. It's just the result of that is a different kind of text. I think coming at a text from a deep knowledge of the original language is more helpful, and particularly on the side of scholarship, right? If it's something that's going to be read by students or is going to stand as the sort of first translation of a thing into another language. But I mean, these are questions that translators bump up against all the time. How deeply inside a language or a dialect do you need to be in order to tackle it? There's also some controversy about how rigidly you should try to perfectly capture a sentence from one language to the next, right? So for example, if it's an idiom that has a kind of it's an unusual metaphor or something, some translators would say, well, you have to render that idiom, even if it doesn't make sense to an English speaking reader or listener, it's your obligation to render exactly what that author wrote. And others would say, well, if the point is it's an everyday idiom that anyone, would know, but then you put that into English and no one knows what you're talking about, then have you actually translated it or not? I mean, in some very literal sense, yes, you have, but you haven't translated the experience of listening to it, where something would be just so familiar and easy. So I'm more on the side of the obligation to try to create a parallel experience, but it is a constant line that you have to walk, and you have to keep asking, keep judging those decisions along the way. You can never kind of set up, here are my rules, and then not encounter 80 questions along the way that are related to those rules you've set up for yourself, but not quite the same. So then you have to choose kind of one by one how to render it. And again, so for me, that is the beauty part, right? That's the fun part of the challenge, to keep kind of going, well, it's sort of like this, but it's more like that. So let's go with that.
I love the layers, all the deep considerations you have to take, and that there isn't a right answer. It's really, really fascinating. Well, you talked about how you often translate Strindberg. How did you determine that you wanted to translate Strindberg? And just in general, how do you decide what you want to translate? And if it's been translated before, do you ever do translations that have already been translated?
Yeah, well, I am fascinated by Strindberg's dramaturgy. His plays run the gamut from naturalism, which in its day was quite innovative. Right now, realism dominates, but it's sort of companion naturalism. Sort of now we have some kind of hybrid, probably you would call it, realism and naturalism together. But in the European avant-garde, his naturalism in the form of Miss Julie was radical. And every few years he had some new kind of massive shift and change in how he was writing plays. So journey plays, dream plays, just huge divergences from what was dominating European stages in the 19th century and early 20th century, which was melodrama, right? Which was very formulaic, very clear, essentially sort of black hats, white hats, right? And some kind of crisis, right? Like, I can't pay the rent, you must pay the rent, right? That kind of thing. And so he was taking these just radically different approaches to how to tell stories for the stage. And I became interested in that in grad school. And then, as part of discovering that, I learned about his history plays, which no one really knows, but they also, they sort of mirror those dramaturgical innovations that are visible in things like Miss Julie and A Dream Play and To Damascus, and even his intimate theater works, these kind of small scale, well, intended for a small scale space, large in emotional scale plays. So those history plays, which represent about a third of his 60 plays, had all been translated in the 1950s and 60s by a scholar out of the University of Washington. And they are fine in the sense that they're accurate. But there's something about the Swedish about Strindberg Swedish, which is just, what's the word? It's quite active, and there's an ease to the language. So that translator at the University of Washington, his name is Walter Johnson, and great scholar of Scandinavian drama. But I wouldn't necessarily say that his translations are very playable or kind of lyrical. And so I read them and thought, oh, I really want these to be produced. They're so interesting. And, one of the things that fascinates me about history plays in general is that they are, of course, as much about the period in which they're being written as the past that they represent. And I think that is that's true of history plays and plays with historical contexts today, which is part of that sort of duality of a history play is really fascinating to me. So I wanted to see if they would have a chance to be staged if they had fresher translations that more easily spring from modern mouths. And so I delved in, and one of them did have a production at the Strindberg Rep in New York City a few years ago. And another one was published. I think, they're hard sells, they're big plays. Strindberg is a complicated figure historically. His gender politics are not very well examined, even for a person of his era. And even if we put them in the context of, as I do, I think he was a polemicist and, very aware of how articulating controversial views was going to bring him attention. We certainly you see that a lot today, right? In our internet era, it's almost as though he's a precursor of that too. So anyway, did I answer your question? I feel like
you definitely did. Yes. And congratulations on the performance and the publication.
Yeah. Just hearing you talk about how deeply you studied Strindberg, I'm curious when, especially within a translation, when you're trying to have that creative conversation with yourself of, do I translate exactly what's here, or am I trying to capture what you want so that it's a parallel experience for this other audience? How deeply do you need to know the writer and their body of work? I think about, as I dramaturg with other people, is really focusing on their intention, but I can look them in the face and ask them, what's your intention here? You don't have that ability with Strindberg. So I guess I'm just wondering, how deeply do you need to know that work? and the playwright themselves?
Well, I mean, I guess need is a sliding scale, right? Because it's like sometimes you can't really know their body of work if you're translating someone's first play. So there's that. But I mean, I think in terms of Strindberg, because he wrote so much, oh gosh, of all kinds. I mean, he was prolific, not just as a playwright, but as a journalist. And he wrote novels and autobiography, and he painted, and he thought he was an alchemist, and he was an early photographer. He kind of had he found artistic expression in pretty much everything he did. So when I'm translating the history plays that I have read most of those things and that I'm really familiar with his plays, can help me understand the structural experiments of his history plays, which then help me make sure that those structural experiments are visible in the translation. So, I guess the history play has, as a form, right, has kind of clear examples. So they're like Shakespeare's Henry IV plays are kind of key examples. There are German Romantic history plays and it has this form, the quick and dirty definition of which is that where a tragedy follows the fate of an individual, a history play fundamentally is focused on the fate of the state. So at the end of a history play, you are less focused on, what will happen with Hal, right? Than the way that Hal represents the next step for England. What's kind of really fascinating structurally about Strindberg's history plays is he's still finding a way to make his history plays fundamentally about the fate of Sweden. Most of them are about Swedish history, not all of them, in really interesting ways, even though he takes these sometimes kind of surrealistic turns, or he leaves realism behind in some way, or he's really embracing naturalism in a way that's very unexpected for a history play. And he's really, in his history plays, focuses more on common non-aristocratic characters, even more than Shakespeare does. So having a breadth of knowledge about not just the play I'm working on, but Strindberg's plays in general, helps me decode his tactics or something, and know how to draw attention to them in the good way, right? Like make it clear to a potential reader or producer, actor, director, what he's trying to do or show or say.
So I'm going to ask you about the process of writing the translation of a script. And, do you have an editor you're working with? Do you have other collaborators? When you're writing, is it always from a place of, I'm interested in sharing this with an English speaking audience, or is it, I've got a commission or something like that, and so that's why I'm doing it? What is that process like for you?
Well, most of my translations have been self-generated, a thing that I just wanted to do. A couple have been commissions, and one that is probably the best illustration of how the thinking changed is Yale Rep wanted what they were calling a literal translation, which is a misnomer, right? I think we covered this slightly, that there's just no way to literally render from one language to the next. So that was, kind of impossible. But how I interpreted that for them was to kind of translate from one to another, and be very vigorous about adding a note. Oh, there's also this layer that this, is maybe not showing. But they wanted this literal translation of actually a film script, Autumn Sonata, that was Bergman. So it was written and directed by Ingmar Bergman, but Ingrid. It was Ingrid Bergman's last film, I believe. And it's beautiful, actually. It's a beautiful film. But Robert Woodruff wanted to do a production, a stage production of it. So, and he, as a director, wanted to have total control over the text. So I was supposed to create this kind of scaffolding that he could then adjust and massage and, change. So that was interesting because I knew I was trying to offer up a perspective, but ultimately I was going to have zero control over what he decided to cut, reword, anything. So that was kind of an interesting adventure. With other pieces, I guess I'm just kind of trying to satisfy my ear, and I try to do it in layers. So I'll do a first pass and then I will gather people to read it aloud because, much like a new play, you just hear different things when it's in someone's mouth and you're putting it aloud. You can hear where you've not put enough punctuation, or there's a run-on, or there's a really awkward turn of phrase that is probably the result of like idiosyncratic grammar, that just the sheer arrangement of words differs from one language to the next, and maybe you kind of got the meaning but you didn't sufficiently rearrange the words so that they sound natural to an English speaking tongue. And then I'll go back and make revisions, and ideally, again, like a new play, it would be possible to make polishing changes through the first couple of weeks of rehearsal, and to get it really where you feel like you've addressed anything that is creaky or doesn't quite capture what you want it to. And then, sometimes for modern audiences, the earlier plays, and this happens with Chekhov all the time, with Shakespeare, where we do some kind of internal trims to tighten it up. Modern audiences tend to have a different tolerance for how much language they want to listen to, probably influenced by all manner of things, including television and film. And so that doesn't mean you have to do that. It just often happens. And so if it's your translation that's gonna happen to, you kind of want to be a part of the conversation about which things get tightened up.
That makes me think of something you said earlier about how you're translating for, the audience in this time, also translating what was in the play for, the folks at that time. And it makes me wonder if sort of like the translation from the 50s, and then you did a different translation now, if, in another 50 years, someone might look back and go, yeah, this needs a new translation just based on, how we've evolved as a society, et cetera. So
Yeah.
It will. Yeah. So cool.
Yeah, the more I hear you talk about it, actually, how there's that line that you're flirting with of like literal translation and then like giving yourself some more artistic license is, I feel like there's another line that you flirt with of it not turning into an adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes you can like look at something, you're like, hey, this actually, if I change these 3 things, and they're huge, but if I change these 3 things, it will really resonate with today's audience.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder, one, have you done that? Where you it started out as a translation and then it moved into more of an adaptation, or if it's a thing where you kind of like slap your hand and like, no, I'm focusing on this translation, but maybe down the line, I might adapt this into maybe not even a play, but like you did a screenplay as your project for your McKnight, or like a novel or short story.
Yeah. Well, I have never gone in thinking I'm going to create that first, but there are a couple of plays that I've translated, Christina and Charles the 12th, that I definitely have really clear ideas about how they could be adapted, but larger changes that would take them into a different place, but still grapple with the dramatic problem that Strindberg was putting on stage. but I've always thought I want to create the thing that feels like it's the rent I don't want to say, how do I want to put it? That's I guess faithful, but it's like the word natural, right? Faithful. Well, what does that mean to you, right? To me, that means this thing about capturing as best I can the language and tone of the original, and then once that exists as a separate document, then I feel like, okay, now I can steal from it, steal from that kind of more faithful translation and go further afield. And I don't know if that's just a little mental game I play with myself or not, but I want to first get so inside of it that I make this kind of whole version of the original. And before I start thinking along the lines of what if something else interceded, or if I wanted to take a different approach to this. But adaptation is super, I mean, it's all a sliding scale. I mean, I think we call it different things. We call it translation and adaptation, but the adaptation that Jackson, Grace Gay, and I did of Maeterlinck's play, The Interior, that's what we read a few minutes of at the McKnight presentation. We really just used it as inspiration to begin with. And because we were taking this, short symbolist kind of abstract play from 1895 and turning it into a screenplay based in contemporary times. So like already that's a radical shift. And then we went really far afield. Someone could have read that screenplay. Even now, probably you could read that screenplay and you could have zero idea that there is any connection to any previous dramatic piece. But we went really far afield, and then we ended up going back to the Maeterlinck and reading it aloud to each other again, and thinking, oh, actually, we could kind of tighten ours up to resemble this a little bit more, and it would probably be useful. It's like a scaffolding, right? Whatever the original source material is, you can use it as this kind of beautiful scaffolding to tell the same story, an amended story, or a radically different story. And I love that idea. I think it's akin to why I love covers of songs, because I think, at least, I love hearing the original in the reinterpretation. And so listening to a cover is this, I'm not that I don't also like to listen to the original, but listening to covers gives you this dual experience of kind of hearing both simultaneously. And so adaptation and translation, it's a little bit akin to that. You get this kind of double resonance happening that is really, or can be, I suppose, is the better way to say it, really satisfying.
I'm into that double resonance. Can you talk about copyright laws and what people might consider when they're thinking about doing a translation?
Yeah, well, I mean, simplest case scenario, you find something in public domain that's old enough to be in public domain, and then you don't have to worry about that. You just copyright your own version. Otherwise, you really must, there's not a choice. You must gain permission from the writer or that person's estate in order to do a translation. I mean, of course, I suppose you could do it just as an exercise for yourself, but why? I mean, I guess I would say don't, because translations and adaptations really require so much creative energy. Yeah, I just get permission if it's a thing that you want to do.
Yeah.
That's cut and dried, I guess. I don't know why you would ever just do it for the fun if you didn't have permission, because it's such a labor of love, hopefully. But yeah.
I mean, I feel like people do that with IPs all the time, or intellectual property all the time, is they're like, they're going to hear how good this adaptation or this translation is, and then they're going to give me permission. But that kind of leads into, what are some pitfalls of translations, and what kind of separates a great translator from a not so great translator?
Well, I think that issue of tone that we've touched on is the hardest. You really have to tune your ear. And this is where knowing the language really well that you're translating out of is helpful, because then you understand when something is sarcastic or playful or stern in a different way than if it's just words, right? And especially if you don't know the language well, and you don't know the everyday constructions and signals in a language, it would be really easy to flat misinterpret, right? And actually have an error because you've misunderstood the tone, but then also misunderstanding the tone and rendering something in just a way that just sounds too formal or too, I don't know, the closest I always think of it as creaky. When you can just hear the words, it's almost like they're just like, crunching up against each other, as if you are, it's like mispronouncing a word, right? It's almost like you have the wrong emphasis, and all you can hear is like, that's wrong. So I think the biggest pitfall is not understanding the tone enough, and or just failing to render it in a way in English that captures a smooth and, well, maybe it doesn't want to be smooth, but captures the intended tone, is probably the best way to say that.
Do you have a musical background at all?
I mean, sort of. I played the piano as a child.
Well, just the way that you talk about language, and I think that that's a lot of people, but you talking about the rhythm and the tone, and even giving the example of covers, it just feels like you also have this musical ear for language, where it is important if you're going to have, like, not just the phrasing of words, but how they feel in an actor's mouth, and then also to an audience ear. I just feel like you talk about it in a very musical way.
Yeah, I think that's true of a lot of playwrights too. I mean, I think that's part of Wagner, right? A controversial figure, but his idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, right? Total work of art, the idea that everything merges together. So for him, that was the music, for his operas, the actors, the space, right? That kind of mystic chasm between the performers and the stage, right? That it all worked in harmony. And I think for theater practitioners, we don't talk about it in that way, but often our thinking is kind of leaping to that, right? How does everything work together, from the words on the page to the lights or whatever else is in the space at that moment, right? For a present production. Those are all part of what's telling the story, and they all sort of have to sing the same song, so to speak, right? They all have to be part of how we are telling the story. And that's for sure true of the language.
What advice do you have for people who are interested in getting into translation? And do you know of any resources out there for people who want to learn more?
Yeah, there is a Translators Association that is great. Is it Alta? I think it's Alta. And also there is a theater professor, Adam Versenyi, who has a publication called The Mercurian that is, for those who are interested in translating plays, is a really interesting resource. In which he publishes translations, but he also sometimes publishes essays about translation, etc. So those are two good resources. I think other than that, if translation is something you're interested in, you just wait and watch for your opportunities and make sure your collaborators along the way know of your interest in a certain playwright in another language, or that you have deep knowledge of another language, so that, if they come across a project where they need a translator, you are at the top of their list, or through word of mouth, they find you. Other than that, if you read a thing in another language and you think, oh my goodness, this is amazing. This should be, English audiences should know about this. Then work to get the rights and try to be the one to translate that. I don't know that there is any kind of clear-cut path to here's how you become a translator. I think it tends to be folks who are proficient in something else and that language, and then want to bring the two together. So even often translators of novels, for example, are academics, or it's rare that someone, I think, makes their living exclusively as a translator of literature. Yeah, I think you just have to seek it out, is the upshot.
Well, we have come to that moment in time where we must ask the most important question, our Theater Begins Here question. And we can go first. You can go first.
You go first. I am so excited to hear your answers.
Our answers, which are your answers.
Right. We just quote you. That's all that happens.
Basically. Yeah. Or close to. All right. Well, after this lovely conversation today, and I feel like I wrote down like 5 or 6 different things that could fill in this space. So theater has lots of places to begin. But for me today, theater begins when constraint fuels creativity, as beautifully said by Wendy Weckwerth.
That was one of mine, so that I'm going to eliminate. I was going to do something with that one. Yeah, I really liked how you described, again, I'm like going back to musicality and like how you really described that. And I feel theater begins when you feed into that double resonance between past and present. Yeah, I really dig that and love that.
Yeah, I guess I would say theater begins with asking questions and telling stories, that whatever else we're intrigued by, puzzled about, challenged by, telling stories and asking questions is how we process that. And we know that theater is effective in helping us do that because it's been around for 2 millennia. So even though we keep having this conversation about whether or not the theater is dead or dying, there's something about live performance and asking those questions and processing our lives and our big and small questions through live performance that I think is going to stick around because it has to. We seem to need it collectively.
Hear, hear.
Thanks so much for joining us. Now I need to do more digging into translation, and I feel like reading history. I had to learn about Ingmar.
Join us for our next episode on August 30th, and let us know on Spotify where theater begins for you. Feel free to send your questions to the link in the bio.
Thanks for listening to Playwright Center's Theater Begins Here.